Hi, I am Willis Pierre. I worked on the Hill School faculty for 32 years, retiring in 2002. Today, I would like to give you a brief early history of the Hill School, particularly the buildings and the people who have made the school what it is today. In the late 1700s, David Potts, grandson of John Potts, the founder of Pottstown, owned a little piece of land just east of Pottstown. This land stood on Main Street and had a long sloping hill leading up from the roadway. He called his property the Hill. In 1793, he began the building of a farm on his property. This building ceased in 1795 for various reasons and stood vacant. People in Pottstown thought the house was haunted and always called it Potts's Folly. After it lay vacant for a couple years, David Potts sold the property to Robert and Sarah Hobart. Actually, Sarah Hobart was David's sister. The Hobarts completed the farm. Around 1820, Sarah Hobart painted this watercolor of her homestead. It is done where she stood in what is now the middle of the headmaster's garden. This property passed into the hands of her oldest son, Nathaniel, who then lived on the farm. In 1851, Matthew Meigs bought the property from Nathaniel Hobart. Matthew Meigs probably saw the property because his good friend had started a girls' school right across the street the year before. Reverend Work, who founded the Cottage Seminary, the girls' school, worked with Matthew Meigs at the University of Delaware, where Matthew Meigs was president of the college. Actually, Reverend Work's wife and Matthew Meigs' wife were sisters. At the first opening of the Hill School, May 1, 1851, this was the only building used for school purposes. Matthew Meigs had added a small section to the east end of the building so that he had dormitory rooms and a schoolroom. In 1851, this map depicts the buildings that existed on the campus at that time. You can see the main building, of which Matthew Meigs actually called Main Building. At the top of the hill, with the roadway leading across the front of the house. Also on the property was a gardener's cottage, a stable, and a barn. Down in the corner along Green Street, there is a small house that was built by the Hobarts around 1800, and that house has now been made into a double house. It is 917 High Street now. This is that main building in 1860 with the wooden fence along Main Street and the beginning of the driveway, the west part of the driveway leading up to the main property. This driveway has been changed and does not look exactly like this today. This is the main building with the flag flying on the top, and is taken from the same spot where Sarah Hobart probably stood to do her painting around 1820. In 1873, there was a major fire to the main building at that time called the Meggs House. This was actually the third major fire for this building. In 1884, the building burnt to the ground, was rebuilt. In 1890, there was a disastrous fire, and in 1973, the building again was completely destroyed. The outside stone was taken down and reused so that today the original stone from the 1793 house is still in existence. The gardener's cottage, built in 1793, stood until the late 1970s. After it was owned by the Hill School, it became a house for maintenance and faculty. The stable, always called and listed as a stable, was actually a carriage house. The horses were probably kept in the barn. This stable still stands today, and you can easily see that horses could not have been kept in the lower portion for a real stable. This is that same building done around 1946. It was when the building was made into a pipe club. The windows on the top floor were in the original stable, although there was not a separate floor. That was added much later. The door and window in the lower portion of the stable no longer exist, although you can see where they were from the inside of the building. This building today is the daycare center. The original barn stood on the corner of Sheridan Street and Chestnut Street. This photo is from 1911. Should be realized that Sheridan Street came all the way down to Chestnut Street in those days. This photo would be taken from the maintenance building today, and you can see in the far right-hand part of the photo the outline of the gardener's cottage mentioned earlier. This is actually Chestnut Street going up. The barn now stands where the gymnasium is. As mentioned, Matthew Meigs founded the school in 1851. In 1855, he wanted out of the main building where he would have a little more peace and quiet and not be involved with the dormitories. So he built this building on campus, and he called it the Cottage. He lived in this house for only a few years when his wife, Mary Gould Meigs, convinced him that he should become more a part of the school and move back into the main building. At that time, he sold off the eastern part of the current Hill School campus, so that from this building down to Green Street was sold at that time. Around 1860, Matthew Meigs again wanted to move out of the main building, and he built this home on the far western edge of the campus. He named his new home West Mansion. He moved into this house at that time and lived there even after retirement. Around 1880, when he was moving out of Pottstown, he sold this house, so it was not a part of the Hill School at that time. Around 1924, the Hill School repurchased this house and named it Founder's House in memory of the founder of the Hill School, Matthew Meigs. In 1884, Matthew Meigs gave the Hill School to his son, John Meigs. John Meigs began right away with a building program, which he thought that a great school needed to have the many buildings and resources available for a top-notch education. So he built a wing onto the main building. This wing went out towards the current quadrangle, and you can see in this photo he also built terraced tennis courts that stood where Upper School stands today. In this wing to the main building, John Meigs built on the top floor a schoolroom. This room served as a study hall, a meeting room, and a chapel. On the main floor of this wing was the gymnasium. Also had a swimming pool. George Q. Shepard became the closest member on the faculty in friendship with John Meigs. This home passed down to his daughter, Alice Shepard, who was the first female physician in Pottstown, and the school eventually bought the home from Alice Shepard, and today it is known as Shepard House and serves as a faculty residence. This shows the property in 1887 when John Meigs again repurchased the part of the land that Matthew Meigs had sold off around 1860. It shows the cottage which Matthew Meigs had built, another building right on the current quadrangle, a stable, a helps quarters, and also at that time the little single house on High Street, on the corner of Green Street, there are now 2 large double houses. The cottage, built by Matthew Meggs, was immediately turned into a dormitory by John Meggs when he purchased the property in 1887. You can see in this photo also a small building that Matthew Meggs built in the 1850s as a playhouse for his children. Today, that little playhouse is used as the chaplain's office. The building that stood on the quadrangle in 1887, John Meggs immediately turned into an infirmary. It was called the Sand. This building in 1920 was moved and remained an infirmary but was doubled in size. It is now used as a classroom building. This shows the Sand in the late 19-teens, taken from inside the chapel. After the Sand was moved to its present location, you can see the second bay windows on the right. You can also see the front porch, which has now been enclosed. It was enclosed sometime after the move to its current location. In 1920, after the Sand was moved and the building was made into a full-fledged infirmary, meeting all state requirements for a hospital, the porches were added to the eastern end. These porches remained until the mid-1970s, when they were torn off and the building was made into a classroom building. On the property purchased in 1887 from George H. Potts, this was the stable on that property. That stable exists today as a music house. The front that you see here is quite different today, but if you go into the lowest level where the horses were kept, it is very much like it would be kept in the days that the building was built around 1860. A building that used to stand between the current music house and classroom building was the Chestnut Street Cottage. It was on the property in 1887 when John Meggs bought this end of campus and was used as a helps quarters until it was torn down in 1960 when McCune Lodge was built. In 1888, there was a toboggan run that ran from in front of the current library down to where the Dell is today. You can see the current music house or the old stable on the right. This toboggan run only existed for that 1 year and then was taken down. This shows the toboggan run taken from what is today the Dell, looking up towards the top of the toboggan run. Again, you can see the music house or old stable on the left. It was mentioned the small house on the corner of Green Street that was built around 1880. In 1878, George H. Potts, who owned the property at that time, made a double house out of that house and added a second double house. The houses stood on the property in 1887 when purchased by John Meigs, had been used during the years following as dormitories, then as a faculty club, and then for many years as faculty residences. In 1890, Herman Meigs was given permission to build a home on campus. He named his home Hillside. It was completely redone after the Meigs House fire in 1973 as a building to house the headmaster's office, the alumni office, and the admissions office. This home exists today as an admissions office. Another view of Hillside, which is now called Meigs House after the 1973 fire. This is from High Street. You can see there used to be a walkway going up from High Street. You can also see that the porches have now been enclosed. In 1884, John Meigs built a powerhouse. It existed where the alumni office is today. This building stood until the current power plant was built around 1930. John Meigs in 1887 built a wing onto the main building. The end of that wing was called the annex. He eventually, in the next few years, built two wings onto the annex. And with those two wings and the annex, the major dormitory on campus was called middle school. This photo, you can see the sand and the cottage in the background, along with a wooden running track on the quad. In 1887, when John Meigs bought the eastern end of the property, he immediately made a new playing field where there had been an orchard. A few years later, a bleachers was built on the baseball field that he had developed at that time. In 1899, the Pottstown had widened High Street all the way to the Hill School. They needed some property from John Meigs at that time to be able to widen the street. John Meigs agreed to give the property to the town, provided they would build a wall. However, he did have specific requests that had to be met. Every stone had to be of a certain size. They had to use the local Glasgow stone, and there had to be a stairway, now known as the hole in the wall, built across the street from Madison Street, and there had to be two stairways built by his homes that he had near Green Street. At that time, the driveway was changed with the current loop in the driveway now, because the horse and buggies could not climb the incline if they had kept the old outline of the driveway. This shows the Dell, built in 1892, but Probably more importantly, in the background are two buildings. The Chestnut Street Cottage was built in the 19-teens as a helps quarters, and the small building in the front, at the end of the football field, behind the dell, was lived in for many years by Willis Struthers, who was the doorman to the main building. Willis Struthers was hired in 1900 by John Meigs and retired in 1967. The chapel was built in 1902. The first service was actually held in 1904. The inside of the chapel looks a little different today in that there are new chandeliers, and the pulpit is no longer in the center of the chapel, but instead on the side. This shows what is currently the Center for the Arts parking lot. The buildings on this property were bought up by the Hill School, used for a time as faculty and helps quarters, and then in 1990, when the Center for the Arts was built, these houses, the ones that had not already been torn down, were torn down and made into a parking lot for that building. The street on the side is Sheridan Street, which at one time went all the way down to Chestnut Street on campus. It was closed off at the time the current gymnasium was built. This shows the upper school, built in 1910 by John Meigs. It is the largest dormitory on campus, and it was the last building built by John Meigs. In 1914, a building was built for Miss Elizabeth, John Meigs' sister. At that time, additional quarters were needed as a new headmaster was coming on campus. Miss Elizabeth had lived with John Meigs and his family during her entire lifetime. This building then was occupied later by Mrs. John Meigs, who named it Hillrest because she wanted it to eventually become a guest house on the Hill School campus. Hillrest exists today as a faculty quarters. In 1914, Dwight Meigs decided to, and needed to, expand the dining room. This photo was taken in 1912. The fireplace at the end of the dining hall is in the same spot the fireplace is today in the dining hall, but it is a different fireplace. You can see the lengthwise of this dining room is what is now the width of the current dining room. In 1914, the dining room was expanded to double its floor space, and it looks today pretty much like this photo, with the exception of the alcove that was added in the late 1950s. This photo in 1914 shows the dining room expansion, and obviously before the alcove was added, so there is no archway on the drive. This shows the dining room today with the alcove in it. At the time the dining hall was expanded, Dwight Meigs also added the cloister. This is a photo taken from what is today the front of the Academic Center towards the dining hall. The piano house was built in the 19-teens. Today is used as a security building. Gate House was one of the 3 King Street houses bought up by the Hill School in the teens and early 20s and used as faculty residence and dormitories. In the late 1960s, these 3 houses were torn down to make way for the current Dutch Village, 4 colonial-style faculty residences and dormitories. The flagpole on the quadrangle was erected in 1920, given by the members of that class to memorialize 3 members of their class who died during their years at the Hill School. This flagpole stood until 1975, when it was blown over by a severe windstorm. Hofer House was bought by the Hill School in 1920. It was the home of Alan Hofer, who was the school treasurer. The building stood until 2004, when it was torn down and a new house was built on that corner. Hofer House was used as a faculty residence up to that time, and the new building is also used as a faculty residence. Memorial Hall was built in 1920 by Dwight Meggs. At that time, it had a theater on the lowest floor, and the second floor consisted of a new library. There is also a memorial room to memorialize those Hill students who served in the First World War. In the 1980s, Memorial Hall was redone into a library. The theater was taken out after the Center for the Arts was built. The memorial room has been brought up to date to also honor those Hill students who served in the wars since. So it now includes the Second World War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Howard House was built in 1920 by Kenneth Howard, who worked in the treasurer's office. It is now called Delwood House and has been used as a faculty residence for the entire time since it was built. This shows West Quad and what is now the headmaster's garden. This photo is from around 1920, just before the headmaster's garden was built. The headmaster's garden, built in 1922, has a beautiful gate at the entrance, which today is about 250 years old. Pine House was bought by the Hill School in the 1920s. It was built in the early 1860s by Daniel Price, who was the president of the First National Bank of Pottstown. It was named Pine House to honor the chairman of the English department, Frank Pine. It has been used as a faculty residence and dormitory over all these years, and more recently just as a faculty residence. The Arts and Crafts Building was built in 1930, at that time called Hobby House, always called the Arts and Crafts Building. Today, This building is occupied completely by the alumni office. The Sweeney Gymnasium, named for Mike Sweeney, director of athletics from 1894 until 1936. This is taken from what is today the front of the Center for the Arts and shows the gym before a hockey rink was added to the east end. In the 1930s, the school was given a piece of land outside of town, and a weekend camp was built. It was used quite a bit at that time when students were not allowed to go home on weekends. There was a small building so students could go out on a Saturday after classes and stay until late Sunday afternoon when they had to return to campus. In 1946, the school bought this home from the Thoreau family and named it Rolfe House in honor of Mr. Rolfe, who served on the Hill School faculty for 52 years. Around 1960, a much larger dormitory was built on campus, and it was felt that a major building should be named for Mr. Rolfe. So this building was renamed Thoreau House in honor of the family who had sold it to the Hill and who had so many members of their family attend the Hill. The Hill School became coeducational in 1998. This sign stood for many, many years on High Street, depicting the school as an all-boys school. Obviously, the sign was taken down in 1998. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that I have been able to give you an idea of what the Hill School history has been to make it into the great school that it is today.